very much for coming. I'm Richard Prum in ecology and evolutionary biology and the director of the Franke program in science and the humanities. Thanks for coming. I see today's speaker has attracted lots of new faces, so welcome to today. April is extraordinarily busy for all of us here at the university, but just to let you know, we have a few exciting things coming up. Many of them are collaborative ventures with environmental humanities, the forestry school, and elsewhere. So, for example, on tomorrow, Tuesday the 18th at noon, we're co-hosting a second of the environmental humanities talks on the papal encyclical Care of Our Common Home. Then on Thursday to Saturday, April 20th to 22nd, there's the Editing Nature Summit, organized by the Yale Institute for Biospheric Studies and ourselves. Then on Saturday, April 22nd, there's New Perspectives in Environmental History, a conference being held all day. And then the last Schulman lecture in Science and the Humanities, Mindful Minds, Different Brains, Historical Reflections on America's Love Affair with Meditation. That's on Wednesday, April 26th at 5 p.m. And then lastly, a shameless plug of my own. I have a book party coming up on May 8th, my own book on the evolution of beauty. There is actually some humanities content there as well. Okay, that May 8th at 4 at the Pivo. So it's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Hasok Chang. He is the Hans Rausing Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. Educated at Caltech and at Stanford. His interests include the history and philosophy of chemistry and physics from the 18th century onward. He has most recently served as the Vice President for the British Society for History of Science, his 2004 book, I think based on his dissertation, was Inventing Temperature, Measurement, and Scientific Progress. And most recently, he's the author of Is Water H2O? Evidence, Pluralism, and Realism. So it was through his book on Is Water H2O that a colleague of mine and I read in a biology seminar, graduate seminar some years ago, and it's taken a number of years with Hasok's busy schedule. But I'm really pleased to finally be able to host him here at Yale, and today he will be speaking on Is There Room for Pluralism in Science? Please join me in welcoming Hasok.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Professor Prum, and I also want to thank Professor Wagner. Somewhere in there, yes, for inviting me to Yale. I want to thank Thai Camp for organizing my whole trip so nicely. And of course, I'm told Mr. Franke is here. Thank you very much for making this whole thing possible. It is actually my first time speaking at Yale, so it's a great pleasure and honor. And I'm especially pleased to be speaking in the Franke program, as the joining of the science and the humanities is really one of the main concerns of my own academic life. Now, what I want to present to you today is an argument for pluralism in science. Before I say anything, is the volume okay? Is everybody hearing? Good. Now, to put it very briefly, what I mean by pluralism is a commitment to maintain multiple systems of knowledge in each field of inquiry, even if they disagree with each other in some important ways. For a very brief example, consider the long-running competition between the wave theory of light and the particle theory of light, insights and results from each of them feeding productively into much later developments that we now have in the form of quantum mechanics. Couldn't have had it without both wave theory and particle theory having developed as they did. So the basic pluralist intuition is that the progress of science is actually helped by having multiple theories and multiple methodologies, even within one field of science. Each approach would make its own distinct contributions to knowledge, and the different approaches can also interact productively with each other. Science has often benefited from such plurality, and it would be helped by having more of it. Now, this is a deliberately controversial position, and today's talk, I decided, should be a rhetorical exercise designed to destabilize some existing intuitions and plant, hopefully, some fresh thoughts in your head by means of some imaginative arguments and memorable examples. Now, you can find the systematic defense of pluralism and some detailed case studies in my book of 2012, which Rick has kindly mentioned. And I'm going to be publishing further developments of that account in the next few years. I mean, just to show you a view of what the systematic arguments look like, I argue that there are these kinds of benefits of tolerating different systems of knowledge within a field of science, and I argue that there are these benefits of interaction. But I assume you didn't fly me out all the way from England to hear me recite what you can just read in a book at home with your feet up, with a glass of wine, whatever you do when you read. So I'm going to do something slightly different, giving you highlights of some of the arguments that are contained in the book and some which are not in the book. The opposite of pluralism would be monism, and monism is taken as common sense by most people who appreciate and defend science. According to monism, we should seek the one scientific truth about the one reality that we all inhabit together, also assuming that there is one right answer to each given question and one right method for arriving at it, and perhaps even the right list of questions to be asking. More precisely, here's a characterization of scientific monism from actually three of the leading pluralists. Stephen Kellert, Helen Longino, and Ken Waters, who called themselves the Minnesota pluralists because they were all working at Minnesota. Helen Longino now at Stanford, Ken Waters in Calgary, leading philosophers of science. They put it this way: monism says that, one, the ultimate aim of a science is to establish a single, complete, and comprehensive account of the natural world, or at least a part of the world investigated by that science, based on a single set of fundamental principles. Monism also maintains that the nature of the world is such that it can, at least in principle, be completely described or explained by such an account. And there exists in principle method or methods of inquiry that, if correctly pursued, will yield such an account. And I think this is pretty much common sense among many scientists, many people who cherish and defend science in public, as well as philosophers of science. Here's a striking example of the monist dream by physicist Steven Weinberg, right? I mean, one of the leading pioneers of the road contributions towards the grand unified theory of elementary particle physics. He wrote in his book Dreams of a Final Theory in 1992, "The century now coming to a close has seen in physics a dazzling expansion of the frontiers of scientific knowledge. Often we have felt as did Siegfried after he tasted the dragon's blood, when he found to his surprise that he could understand the language of birds." I thought that was for ornithologists, but this is Wagner, right? But now we are stuck, because this was the time when Congress was debating whether to continue funding the superconducting super collider project, which they did cancel shortly afterwards. Weinberg was pushing for more money, right? We're stuck, give us more money, we can do it. Our present theories, it says, are of only limited validity, still tentative and incomplete. But behind them, now and then, we catch glimpses of a final theory, one that would be of unlimited validity and entirely satisfying in its completeness and consistency. It's a grand dream indeed. It's the kind of dream I personally had when I was a teenager, which pushed me into theoretical physics, hence Caltech, and I quickly found out this wasn't what the day-to-day life of a physics student involved, and I did carry on with some more physics, but I won't tell you my autobiography now. This is just a striking statement of the monist dream, and when we look more closely, we can see two quite distinct ways in which monism manifests in science. First is this idea of the entire unity of science, mostly conceived through reductionism. So here's Ernest Rutherford. Some of you will have recognized his face. He is alleged to have said at one point, all science is either really physics or it's just stamp collecting. And this is, not a rare attitude among fundamental physicists. As punishment for insulting everybody like this, they gave him a Nobel Prize in chemistry. That was for the transmutation of elements, so you can see why chemists were excited about that. Here's Dirac, the great theoretical physicist, who said in 1929, shortly after the arrival of Schrödinger, Heisenberg himself doing the standard form of quantum mechanics as we know it now, he said, the underlying physical laws necessary for the mathematical theory of a large part of physics and the whole of chemistry are thus completely known. And now we just have to solve some very complicated equations, which was, of course, beneath the geniuses like him. So now we're still struggling with computational quantum chemistry, but in 1929, it's all done, basically, in principle. Here's a cartoon that my undergraduate students gave me once. You can see what's going on. I'm not going to give you the blow-by-blow. It's the psychologist bullying the sociologist, saying, you guys only doing applied psychology. The biologist holding the octopus, saying, psychology is just applied biology, which is just applied chemistry, which is just applied physics. Hey. Right. So it's all just physics, and everything else, right, will be taken care of. This is Rutherford's dream expressed in a comical way, and actually the whole cartoon also has the mathematician over there. Oh, you didn't see you guys. But it's not just cartoons, it's not just scientists speaking off the cuff. This is an example of two very serious philosophers of science, right? Classic article by Hilary Putnam and Paul Oppenheim, 1958, where they give you exactly that picture which was given in the cartoon, right? They said all of science will be understandable eventually in terms of elementary particles, because they give you the 6 levels of existence in the universe, and stuff in level 6 is made up of stuff in level 5 and so on. So if we start by understanding how elementary particles interact with each other and work stepwise upward, we will have the entirety of science. So that's one mode of monism in which you say all science is one and it is based most likely in physics. This is the other kind of monism which exists within each scientific field. And here what we have is the firm belief by the scientific practitioners, and again others as well, that within each field there is basically the right way to think and the right way to investigate things, the right fundamental beliefs to have. And if you don't adhere to those fundamental tenets of each science, then you will be quickly written off as a credible person. You won't be able to publish anything. You won't be able to get a job, and so on. So, for example, right, what biologists would go against the idea of evolution by random mutation and natural selection today, what physicists would dare propose a theory in which things can travel faster than the speed of light, or have any account of nature in which energy is not conserved. Right? And there are many instances in which this comes to the surface. That's a picture, a blurry picture of British physicist Jim Al-Khalili. He's also a big TV personality over in England. So he's on TV a lot. And this is him on live TV declaring that if the report that had come out at the time, several years ago, that there were some neutrinos observed to be traveling faster than the light, Al-Khalili said if those reports would be confirmed, he would eat his shorts, meaning underwear, which he's holding up there. That's his boxer shorts on live TV. And it's not because Al-Khalili was particularly knowledgeable about the setting of that experiment that these Italian physicists were reporting, or because he was a particular specialist on neutrinos. It's just him as a good normal scientist declaring that this thing they're claiming is just impossible and we know it, right? And we know from Thomas Kuhn, for example, in Philosophy of Science, History of Science, that in what Kuhn called the normal state of science, normal science, the authority enjoyed by the paradigm in each field is an unchallenged monopoly, right? The paradigm tells you what the basic metaphysics of the world, the corner of the world that field deals with is. The paradigm tells you what methodologies to use, and if you go against those dictates of the paradigm, then you cease to be a normal scientist. Now, for Kuhn himself, he wouldn't have said that this kind of monism in normal science was justified because the paradigm at the time was necessarily correct, but he implied that the scientists involved in it themselves would be thinking that. For Kuhn, right, there were many different kinds of benefits of normal science, the most important of which was that the narrowing of focus that the paradigm allowed enabled actually, right, the normal scientist to do esoteric specialist research. And one of the things going on there is that the paradigm allows the scientist to disregard foundational questions, which you could argue about until the cows come home, and which we philosophers do argue about entire lives, right? So scientists won't get any science done if they're engaged in that business. So there are strong motivations, I think, that many people have to sign up to a monist view of science. And here I'm trying to be slightly more systematic. I'm identifying 4 different motivations for people to hold the monist ideal of science. So there's the metaphysical idea that because there is just one world, there has to be only one truth. And of course, it should be the job of science to go and look for that truth. There's also a sort of historical argument based on the track record of science. People believe that there have been great successes in science based on these moves of unification and reduction, and these moves point towards the ultimate truth that monists presume there to be. Just to give you 2 quick examples, I mean, we always hear about the great success of Maxwell's electrodynamics, which unified electricity, magnetism, and optics, which had been considered quite separate sciences until then, all encapsulated in those 4 equations that we still use and put on T-shirts and so on. Maxwell didn't put them in those terms, but never mind that. That's just history of science. The story of molecular genetics, we also hear about how what great advances we made by assuming this one specific mode of working in biology, which also happens to be a reductionist one, so we're doubly happy. And then there are some more practical considerations, right? So when we need to take action in practical life, for example, what do we do about climate change? We need to have a scientific consensus so that we can pull together and carry out some effective actions. And in a similar way, you might feel that there is a need for unified front against these forces of unreason and untruth. And I don't know, if you're going on the March for Science in a few days, you might be feeling this last bullet point very strongly in your heart. The practical concerns are indeed very urgent in the here and now, when the greatest political powers on the planet seem to be bent on a demotion and destruction of scientific truth. It's tempting to opt for strong monism in the face of such threats, which are not entirely new. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just declare the scientific truth and shut down all the nonsense that's contrary to the truth, whether it be creationism and intelligent design, or climate change denial, or the agnotology practiced by tobacco companies? But I'm going to argue that we need to resist this temptation, this wish that science would play the role of the philosopher king or God to tell us what is true and how we should live. So in the rest of my presentation today, I'll try to talk you out of these monist motivations. I'm going to go through them one by one. Now, in response to the idea that there must be one truth because there is only one world, I would stress the inaccessibility and inoperability of such a notion of truth. Now, this is a huge philosophical subject, which I am currently working on, so I'm not going to say much about it today unless you want me to go into it in the discussion period afterwards. I'm just going to leave you for now with a joke that makes the point. So the joke is a brief dialogue between a student and a teacher. Teacher says, "Your composition on my dog is exactly the same as your sister's. Did you copy hers?" And the student gets very indignant. "No, sir, it's the same dog." That at least should make you think about the notion that because there's one world, there can only be one good account of it. What about the idea that the historical track record of science shows the effectiveness of monism? I'm going to spend some time on that one. The common image of scientific progress we have, I argue, are full of monist distortions. Let me talk you through one important example showing how history is often dressed up to make it look like the right theory always triumphs because it is right, and there's only one best theory at any given time, and that best theory is inevitably what leads us in the direction of the ultimate truth. I mean, that's the sort of thing that gets reinforced when we hear about the history of science, whether it be in the popular media or in the introductory chapters of science textbooks, or even sometimes from professional historians of science. So the case I'm going to try to talk you briefly through is the case of the chemical revolution of the late 18th century, featuring the discovery of oxygen and the demise of the notorious Phlogiston theory. The details of this case are presented in the first chapter of my book, but I'm just going to give you some quick highlights here. Now, here's a typical view of what happened in the so-called chemical revolution with Antoine Lavoisier as the great hero. It's the kind of thing Paola Bertucci can tell you all about after I leave, if you want to know more. So here's an entry in a fairly respectable source, the Hutchinson Dictionary of Scientific Biography, which, so the entry there on Lavoisier, it says, he's a French chemist, universally regarded as the founder of modern chemistry. Whenever you read universally, you should be suspicious. It just means, I think. But in this case, it's almost true, right? There are not many people who would deny that Lavoisier was a great, one of the founders of modern chemistry. It continues. His contribution to the science of chemistry were wide-ranging, but perhaps his most significant achievement was his discrediting and disproof of the phlogiston theory of combustion, which for so long had been a stumbling block to a true understanding of chemistry. For those of you who don't know what phlogiston is, it was this presumed substance contained in combustible substances, and when the combustible substance burnt, the heat and light coming out of it was, they said, phlogiston escaping. That's the initial idea, and as I have argued in print, it gets a lot more sophisticated than that as it develops, and it was a worthy opponent of the theory that Lavoisier was proposing. But I'm not going to tell you all of that. I'm just going to give you a few moments of irony, actually. So here is a list I quickly pulled out. 3 of Lavoisier's very top contributions, major innovations, right, to the science of chemistry. First, he advanced a new theory of acids, according to which he said all acids contain oxygen, and oxygen is what makes an acid acidic. This is, some of you may know, right? This is why he called the thing oxygen. It's a made-up word from Greek roots, meaning the generator of acids. He was so proud of his acidity theory, he called the thing oxygen. Germans still call this Sauerstoff, right? And it's very obvious when you say it in German. I don't know how you guys can live with this. In English, we say oxygen because we don't have any idea what it means. The second item was the caloric theory of heat. Lavoisier said that heat consisted in a material substance that flows in and out of things, which we've, of course, rejected now. But he was very serious about it. This is Lavoisier's table of chemical elements, at the top of which is lumière, light, caloric, and then oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen. The very first chapter of his new textbook of chemistry was about caloric and what it does. Not something that he accidentally just walked into that we can disregard as not an essential part of his chemistry. And third, of course, his new theory of combustion. But, I mean, this is something we don't usually ask. So we say, yeah, Lavoisier taught all of us that combustion is combination with oxygen. What does combination with oxygen have to do with light and heat coming out? Now, we have the story in modern times about energy levels and how, right, potential energy is manifested in terms of heat and light energy. But Lavoisier didn't have that story. This is 70 years before energy conservation. So what did he have? He had this theory that combustion generated heat because it was the combination of a combustible substance not with just any kind of oxygen but with oxygen gas. And oxygen gas, according to him, was a combination of what he called oxygen base and lots of caloric. And when oxygen gas met a combustible substance, the oxygen base had a higher affinity for the combustible substance, like charcoal, than it did to caloric. So it went and divorced caloric, married the charcoal, and the caloric was released in the free and perceptible form. So Lavoisier only got rid of this phlogiston idea by inventing and enthusiastically buying into this idea of caloric. Just like phlogiston, a weightless substance, sticking like a sore thumb in his whole system of chemistry based on this obsession with tracking things by their weights. Long story, right? And already by 1802, this was in a standard textbook of chemistry, all kinds of problems with that Lavoisier theory of combustion, none of which is about caloric being non-existent, but this is about the internal logic of the theory. For example, gunpowder burns really well, even in the absence of oxygen in a gas form. It contains oxygen within itself, but not in the gas form. So that doesn't work out. Inconveniently, Lavoisier was the superintendent of the Paris arsenal in charge of gunpowder. So he and his close colleague Berthollet had a very interesting argument about how gunpowder would work out. But don't let me get into the details, because then you will be here forever. So let me move on. Now, when I tell you stories like phlogiston and oxygen and all that, you may think, that's just chemistry, and it's old chemistry. This is not the serious kind of science we should be looking to as our ideal. So, if there are those of you in the room who suffer from physics envy, let's talk about some physics, right? And the main thing I'm going to try to tell you is that even physics isn't like physics. Even physics isn't like the way the monists imagine physics to be. And there are a few different points here which I'll try to go through quite quickly in the interest of time. Now, something that really feeds the monist enthusiasm about physics is the idea that in physics we have these theories of universal applicability, right? Starting with things like Newton's universal law of gravitation. So it's a very convenient basis to build monist science on, right? It wouldn't work as nicely if you had a law of nature that worked within only certain confines and broke down outside. Newton came up with his laws of motion and gravitational law, which had universal validity. And since then, we've been led to believe that all fundamental laws, theories of physics are like that. But it really is just a presumption. I mean, it was for Newton himself. He knew that himself very well, right? Because all the data he had were from, at best, within the solar system. And he says, and I think that applies everywhere. And he knew, he was uncomfortable with it, which is why he put up this so-called rule of reasoning in philosophy, meaning natural philosophy, which said one should generalize unless there are specific reasons for not doing so. So we say, yes, general relativity and quantum mechanics, these theories apply everywhere. Therefore, whatever macro physics that we might have has to be reducible to one of these theories or their descendants that are even more general, right? Now, why do we think that? I don't want to go deeply into general relativity here, but let me remind you that when general relativity was accepted, it was on the basis of 3 specific tests, right? Bending of light, redshift, and the perihelion shift of Mercury. 3 very, very specific tests, on the basis of which somehow the physicists declare that this theory applies to the entire history of the universe everywhere. And I don't get that. Let's think about quantum mechanics. I mean, before we really get excited about Schrödinger's cat and everything, why don't we make sure that quantum mechanics does apply to cats? Why are we so sure about this? And there are, in fact, some physicists who are seriously making empirical investigations of this, right? Led, for example, by Anton Zeilinger in Vienna. They are trying to see what size molecules they can use to show the quantum interference effects. So their view is, there is a limit to the applicability of quantum mechanics, and we're going to experimentally find out where the boundary is, rather than just assuming It just applies universally because it has to, right? So, I think we need to ask, where do we actually use these theories, fundamental theories, and where do we need other theories? So, for example, in solid state physics, which I'll come to more if there's time, in order to explain things like superconductivity and superfluidity, they realized that they had to have concepts at that level which weren't apparently reducible to concepts of elementary particle physics. Here's another great irony. I mean, most of you will have suffered through this, whatever your field of study. When we teach physics to students today, why do we make everybody suffer through Newtonian mechanics first? Because we then tell them, oh, it's all wrong, and here are better theories. But why do we have to teach them the wrong theory first? Why not just get rid of it like we don't teach Aristotelian physics in year one, right? But we have to start with Newton. That's because Newtonian mechanics is still extremely useful. I mean, what is rocket science for the most part is Newtonian mechanics. We don't fly rockets with general relativity. We might make some specific corrections to the Newtonian picture using general relativity, but that's not we can't do the whole thing with general relativity, certainly not with quantum mechanics. So Newtonian physics is clearly very useful, and that's why we keep it, that's why we teach it, and that's why we keep using it. And this is a prime example of some part of my doctrine, which I called the conservationist side of pluralism, right? This system worked very well during Newton's time in the domain where he was applying it to, and it still works really well in those domains. Nature hasn't changed that much, right? So why not keep that system that works still very well? And we do. This is the practice of physics teaching and physics research and physics application. We do use Newtonian mechanics. We don't throw it away. And there are deeper reasons why we keep Newtonian mechanics as well, which I'll just mention, right? This is the time-independent Schrödinger equation for one particle. Some of you know this, some of you don't. Even if you don't, all you need to notice here is the little m, that is mass. What is mass in quantum mechanics? The meaning of mass came from Newtonian mechanics, and it remains there until you get something like the whole story with the Higgs boson, which Schrödinger certainly had no conception of. So he was just using the classical concept of mass, similarly with what you have to plug into here to the potential function, which is just the Coulomb potential in case of elementary ordinary quantum mechanics. There's some other issues too, which I won't go into in detail right now. So, to sum up this point, the second one, I would say that our image of the inexorable success of monist science is really an illusion, only maintained by a carefully orchestrated selective attention. My old teacher, John Dupre, once wrote that reductionism is not a tide sweeping through all of science. It just is something that happened to be successful in some specific situations. Now, let me come to the third point there. So that's the desirability of a unified theory for effective action. Here I want to take a realistic view of science. I don't mean the realist view of science, so-called, is actually kind of the opposite of that. So yes, if we had an impeccably true unified theory that did everything we needed, that would be great, but we don't. We hardly ever have such a theory. I mean, it was great while the heyday of Newtonian mechanics lasted. It seemed to do a lot of things with a promise to do a lot more. Quickly enough, scientists found out there were very clear limits to the applicability of Newtonian physics. So what do we do in real life situations where most likely we don't have a unified theory that does everything we want? What we need to do is learn to make inquiries and take actions on the basis of the disunified knowledge that we've got. And if we take an honest look at the history of science, we do find many cases in which science and technology made great progress in a pluralist manner. One example, which I'm not going to go through today, is atomic molecular chemistry in the 19th century. This is the subject of chapter 3 of my book, where I argue that there were at least 5 different systems of atomic molecular chemistry flourishing throughout the 19th century, and this pluralistic situation did a lot of good. I am going to tell you a little bit about my current historical research, which is about batteries in the 19th century. Now that might strike you as kind of weird. Who cares about batteries? Well, I make it my business to pick up the simplest things in science, like water being H2O and how to make thermometers, and show actually how complicated they are. So batteries are another one, and much worse than the other things I've seen before. So here's a renowned historian of physics, Helge Krag in Denmark, who wrote in 2000, what makes the voltaic controversy both interesting and unusual is its long duration and complex structure. The voltaic controversy meaning when Volta invented the so-called pile in the year 1799, how did it work? And it was very controversial. So Krag continues, none of the great theoretical breakthroughs of the 19th century had a decisive influence on the controversy. In a modified form, it was revived in the 1880s. Although in a social sense, the controversy had largely disappeared by 1910, there was no consensus on the question of whether or not contact potentials exist as an intrinsic property of metals. So this may sound very strange to you, but that's how it was. The entire 19th century, they argued about how batteries worked and couldn't agree. Yet, to anticipate the conclusion of this brief glimpse at this long project, still great science and technology happened through this pluralist mess. A very quick view of what the argument was about. So there's Volta in his original picture of the pile, which in a little section looks like this. Silver plate on top of which a zinc plate and a wet piece of paper, clothing, cardboard, anything wettable. For Volta, originally, it was just soaked in salt water. And then repeat, pile it up to increase the accumulation of voltage. And Volta's view was that what generated the flow of the electrical fluid, as he put it, is this bimetallic contact. Silver and zinc come together, and the electrical fluid wanted to go to the silver. Right. In contrast, many more people subscribed to the so-called chemical theory, and the way they built the pile was actually different, right? So in contrast to this, they said, no, the cell is a sandwich of two metals with the wet stuff in the middle. And the generator of electricity was the chemical reaction between the wet stuff and one of the metals, in this case, zinc, right? So arguments really carried on about the conflict between contact and chemical theory. And I mean, the mainstream was going into the chemical side, but there were really weird, curious things on the side of the contact theory. So there are so-called dry piles, for example. A voltaic pile made with not wet layers, but dry layers in between. And they don't generate much current, but they do generate voltage. And this is a very bad picture of one that they have at the physics department in Oxford, which has apparently been working for over 100 years. Because there's such little action, it can go on forever. Even more intriguingly, the discovery of the thermocouple by Seebeck in 1821. It's just a loop of two different metals, one here, one there, and you put the two junctions at different temperatures, and suddenly electric current starts flowing, right? This was actually the form of the battery used by Georg Ohm in the experiments that established Ohm's law. Where's the chemical action in that? So that was a very interesting question. And if you ask today's chemistry teachers, how does a battery work? They'll give you this picture, right? Nice. This is the Daniell configuration in which there are actually two electrolytes. One metal dipped in its own solution, the other metal dipped in its own solution. The two electrolytes communicate through a porous barrier, so ionic current is allowed through it, and you just take the redox potential on each side, and the difference between the redox potentials is the cell voltage. Very easy. But Volta's configuration wasn't like that, nor is your Duracell, right? The standard commercial batteries, right, the classic one being the carbon zinc battery. So I found only one chemistry textbook which tells you about this, I mean the university level. And it's this really interesting book called The Extraordinary Chemistry of Ordinary Things by Carl Snyder. It's a first year university level book. He says, although the carbon zinc battery is one of our simpler consumer products, the chemistry that goes on inside that wet black paste is much too complex to be described in detail here. So he didn't do it, and I haven't found another book that does it. Think about, if you know some chemistry, think about why that should produce 1.5 volts. It's not trivial. Now, so that's the story of batteries, which I'm currently investigating. It'll be a whole book, so I can't tell you all the details. But again, the point is that there were many different views and many different experimental traditions that flourished in this field of science and technology, right? And also disputes concerning the very nature of electricity continued throughout the 19th century. It's only at the very end of the century that electrons are discovered, right? So all the profusion of different systems of what I'm calling battery science were done without electrons. Yet, great and lasting scientific and technological achievements were made on that basis. Everything from the telegraph to Maxwellian electrodynamics achieved on the basis of these batteries and the effects that they produced. Again, you might say that such examples only illustrate how things were in the infancy of science and technology. But the same kind of things happen today too. I'm just going to give you one example of cutting-edge modern science, which is the Global Positioning System, GPS. Surely, one of the most impressive and useful scientific technologies of the 21st century, which most of us carry with us on a daily, all the time, right? I don't, because this is my phone, but most of you probably do. This is an example I picked up from a brief mention by Peter Gallison, and I thought about it, and it was a fantastic case illustrating the virtues of pluralism. So this is a prime example of how you can bring different systems together in order to produce something that each of the systems by itself couldn't possibly do. So how does GPS work? Some of you know this very well, better than I do. If you don't, here's the basic idea. You fly a whole bunch of geostatic, right, satellites which maintain their position relative to spots on the surface of the Earth. And then to locate each spot on the surface of the Earth, you fire radiation signals from several satellites, each one tracking how long it takes for the signal to come and go and come back. And from there, you can basically triangulate the position of the spot you want to know about. How do we do this? Well, we have to use Newtonian mechanics, as I mentioned before, to fly the satellites. Then you have to put atomic clocks on the satellites, because the time measurements have to be extremely precise. for which you need quantum mechanics. But that's not enough. You have to correct the atomic clocks using both general relativity and special relativity. Special relativity to account for the slowing down of the clocks according to the speed at which they're moved around. General relativity to correct for the gravitational changing of clock rates. And you have to blend all these different types of physics skillfully together, operate the system, and the satellite will beam down to you on Earth the signal which you use pretending that the Earth is flat. So it's a wonderful blend of all kinds of physics which delivers fantastic results. I'm going to be very brief about the last point. So the last motivation for monism, namely the need for united front against unreason and untruth. I'm just going to say there's great futility and danger in fighting dogmatism with dogmatism. Okay, I think sometimes we have to do it if it's a matter of defeating Hitler, but you can debate how much you got out of that if you did it by subscribing to Stalinism. So I'm just going to leave it at that. If scientists become dogmatic in order to combat dogmatic pronouncements by the church or whatever you got, what will we have gained? So I hope I've been able to take something away from these common motivations towards monism and the fear of what would happen to science and our civilization without monism. But if I may go on for a little bit more, I must anticipate some monist objections, because there are a lot of objections that some of you are probably thinking, and I've always received when I presented these ideas. There are lots of objections, but I'm just going to focus briefly on two of them. The first is the anxiety that people feel in the absence of the notion of the one truth that we can seek and rely on. They feel that if we don't have monism, we're going to end up with a relativist chaos in which just anything goes, to quote Feyerabend out of context. So the slogan I put out is not anything goes, but many things go. But not just anything, right? We survey our situation, we choose several of the best systems that we can afford to maintain and develop. Not just anything that anybody with a loud voice shouts about. So the example people always try to hit me with is creationism, right? So if you're a pluralist, do you have to allow the teaching of creationism in schools on an equal basis with Darwinian evolution? No, right? Because the spirit of pluralism, as I'm advocating, is that we gain scientific benefits from exploring the best of the options that we have. And if you had to rank all the different ways of explaining life, creationism would be like number 632. So you don't want to keep that alive. That's the judgment that I'm making. That's the judgment that we all have to make individually and collectively. So you might want to argue about punctuated equilibrium. You might want to argue about epigenetic inheritance, which people seem to do with great gusto in biology these days. You might even propose to bring back neo-Lamarckism, even the holistic vitalism of Henri Bergson and the like, but not creationism. Right? So that's the first worry. The second one is the second objection to pluralism, which I often get, is something I already mentioned several times. I mean, I often give historical examples, and people say, well, that was then, but this is now, right? There was immature science, and now science has got good enough so that we can be reasonably sure about the basics. Against that notion, there's the famous argument of the pessimistic induction from the history of science. Right? This is the formulation by Stathis Psillos, who himself doesn't subscribe to it at all, but it's a nice summary. So the argument goes, the history of science is full of theories which at different times and for long periods had been empirically successful and yet were shown to be false in the deep structure claims they made about the world. Therefore, the empirical success of a theory provides no warrant for the claim that the theory is even approximately true. So, let's think about the track record of science. There are lots of things people used to believe in, ranging from phlogiston to the ether and beyond. And we've rejected all of those now, but those people are really sure, on the basis of good reasons too. So how can we be so sure that 200 years from now they're going to be laughing so hard at the early 20th century about dark energy and all that stuff? So let's have a little bit of humility. Now, Percy Bridgman, Nobel Prize winning Harvard physicist, had a really grim view about our prospect in science. He said, if we sufficiently extend our range, we shall find that nature is intrinsically and its elements neither understandable nor subject to law. His main work in science was high-pressure physics, increasing the available pressure, attainable pressure by 100-fold from his best predecessors. And sure enough, he found things were weird under those extremely high pressures. Unpredictably weird, like ice having several different crystal structures. Now, I've already discussed this kind of point before, so I'm just going to try to give you a little bit more uplifting vision in conclusion. Here's Joseph Priestley, the tragic anti-hero of the chemical revolution, who made oxygen, called it dephlogisticated air, refused to go with Lavoisier's interpretation. He said this really interesting thing, that every discovery in science brings to our view many things of which we had no intimation before. The greater is the circle of light, meaning knowledge, the greater is the boundary of the darkness by which the circle is confined. And that boundary is ignorance, right? So I made a picture of this. Vast darkness. Knowledge is in this little circle of light. The kind of ignorance that we can deal with is the boundary, right? The deep, dark stuff, that's the unknown unknowns of Rumsfeld. There's nothing we can do about that. So Priestley's picture is the more we know, the more we don't know. Or we know we don't know. But he was happy about this, and that's the last impression I want to leave you with. He continued, notwithstanding this, the more light we get, the more thankful we ought to be. For by this means we have the greater range for satisfactory contemplation. In time, the bounds of light will be still farther extended, and from the infinity of the divine nature and the divine works, we may promise ourselves an endless progress in our investigation of them, a prospect truly sublime and glorious. Now, he's saying it this way because he was a priest, very appropriately named. He was. I'm a humanist. My general perspective is to look at science as a human enterprise. Now, I don't mean in the human chauvinist way. I mean science as something done by intentional agents like Homo sapiens, but not necessarily that. And I think humanism gives us this basic kind of humility, which is the foundation of the pluralist point of view I'm trying to get across. Here's Clarence Irving Lewis, said to have been the last great pragmatist philosopher. And he was reviewing John Dewey's book. And Lewis said, channeling Dewey's spirit, man may not reach the goal of his quest for security by any flight to another world, neither to that other world of the religious mystic, nor to that realm of transcendent ideas and eternal values, which is its philosophical counterpart. Salvation is through work, through experimental effort, intelligently directed to an actual human future. So, let me conclude. With some basic epistemic humility, it is easy to recognize that no system of knowledge in science should be given the right to suppress, exclude, and delegitimize all others, because we need as many systems as we can afford to maintain in order to give ourselves the maximum exposure to reality. The knowledge gained by such a pluralist process can also contribute appropriately to the full actualization of the human potential. After many centuries of struggle and miserable failures, we humans have learned to accept and benefit from such a spirit of pluralism in the realms of politics, culture, language, cuisine, art, and ecology. I believe it's time to admit it in science too. Now, as a coda to this talk, I should explain what this weird picture is, which I also put on the poster advertising this event. It's at once a metaphorical and literal expression of the kind of pluralism I'm trying to promote. So first, literally, it's a long-lost old experiment that I recovered from the past. So it's from this paper of 1806 by a guy named Charles Sylvester. Now, if you've never heard of this man, nobody has. Even the professional historians of science of this period hardly ever heard of him. He was one of these great British amateur scientists of that time, writing in Nicholson's journal. This paper, he says, if a thin coat of a solution of nitrate of silver be laid upon a piece of plain glass, and in the center of this be laid a bit of zinc wire, in a little time a beautiful tree of silver will appear as if growing from the wire. So I read this. I said, yeah, sure. That's going to happen. So I know, I have this kind of experience a lot, reading old science. I get weird reports. Some of them are just crazy, others are actually true. So I thought, how hard is it to check this out? So it's a slight variation I made in his procedure. Instead of a glass pane, I put up a little plastic envelope, the kind you put photographs in. And instead of zinc, I used copper because it comes out prettier. And there's just a dark paper board, the dark green, in the plastic envelope, just to show the contrast better. And I carefully put in a little solution of silver nitrate, about 1 molar, works best. And immediately this happens. Now, everybody would expect that to happen because copper dissolves more readily than silver does in nitric acid. So there's an immediate replacement happening. The alchemists knew about this, no problem. But if you let this sit, this starts happening. So the silver is now growing on the silver. And there's no battery connected to this. It's all self-driving. Right? And after 26 minutes, this is what happened. That was particularly beautiful. The shooting off of the thin slivers. And different configurations start to happen. That particular one, I was very pleased to watch. You could see it just shoot out in real time. So that's the tree, just as Sylvester says. And it's a very small thing. It's a little phenomenon. It's not known to most of the chemists that I talked to today, not because it's that difficult, but because why would you do this? This kind of thing is done sometimes for demonstration. It's usually done with a battery, then it goes a lot faster. But it's actually not trivial to explain why this happens the way it does. And it's just a small example of how history of science can recover some things that are left behind in the forward march of science, especially if that forward march is done in the monistic way. Metaphorically, this is a very fitting image, I think, of pluralist science, an intriguing reminder of the fragility, incompleteness, and many-sided abundance of the pluralistic scientific knowledge that we can develop. I've spoken too long. I'm sorry about that. Let me stop here. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you very much. Please join us at the reception. We are following in the room directly below us. And since this is being recorded, we'd like to get your questions on the microphone. So, any questions? We'll ping the mic.
Yeah, so I was really interested by the quotes you used at the start of the talk, specifically the Weinberg and Dirac and Rutherford quotes. And I wondered if you thought that sort of two different things were going on in this set of quotes, where with the Dirac and the Rutherford, you have a certain kind of aggressive reductionism. The argument is that chemistry and biology, and by implication everything else, reduces to fundamental physics. Whereas with Weinberg, you're getting a different sort of claim that all sorts of forces can theoretically be explained by recourse to one unified theory.
Yeah.
And it seems like physicists end up talking about unified theories or theories of everything actually fairly recently, like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I wondered if this particular brand of monism you're arguing against in your talk is something of a recent development, or what its lineage is exactly.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very nice question. And I mean, just to bring it slightly back to the way I initially framed it, the Weinberg quote, strictly speaking, is only about unity within physics, right? He's not saying that having done the unified theory of physics, we can then take care of chemistry and all the rest of it. But I think it's implied in his thinking. I may be wrong about that, but
He does say that.
yeah, okay, in other places, right, yeah. Now, to your question of whether this is a new phenomenon, I don't think it really is. So this dream of a universal theory of physics, I mean, that does descend from Newton himself, right? The wisdom of Newton was that he knew what to publish and what not to publish. Right? So all that alchemy and theology he did, he knew not to publish, and we only knew much later that he had done all that work. But you know, you can get glimpses of this, for example, in the queries that he attaches to the optics. He talks about the ether, right? A primitive concept of the ether, which was supposed to explain all kinds of things from chemical forces to electricity. After Newton, people get very enamored with the idea of the so-called subtle or imponderable fluids, right? The examples that I mentioned being caloric and phlogiston. So for example, there's this great drive towards a unified theory of imponderable fluids in which people postulated something they called elementary fire, which had these different manifestations: caloric, phlogiston, light, electricity, magnetism. So that drive towards a grand unification certainly has been with us, at least intermittently, throughout modern science. And I guess some people would trace it all the way back to Thales in ancient Greece. So not entirely new, but I think it did come up very strongly in elementary particle physics in the 70s, as you say.
So can I just follow up on that line of questioning, maybe casting newness in a slightly different way? It seemed that the part of that quotation that struck me, the Weinberg quotation, was the funding.
Yes.
You know, we need the money, we're almost there. And it seems like there's probably a way of connecting particular arguments for monism, particular anxieties about the conditions of possibility for doing science. I'm thinking here in particular of Babbage in 1829, whose decline of science argument is in fact an argument about how his calculating machine should be funded by the British government, like the French are funding it. And so I wonder, and so science itself as a whole is declining in this way, but what he really means is, please, I'm almost there, just give me 5 more years of essentially governmental support. I'm wondering if there's a kind of lineage of the connection between monism and money, that pluralism isn't as convincing. right? That somehow
Yeah.
these arguments about pluralism aren't the arguments that are front and center in the March for Science. And there's a kind of tacit monism in some of the ways that it's being described, and I wonder if that's because when push comes to shove, for individual scientists or for scientists as a group, monism seems to cash the checks in a way.
Yeah.
Whether it does in fact or not.
Yeah, I think you're right, absolutely. If I may be crude, monism certainly is a great marketing ploy, right? We are going to give you the truth. Who wouldn't fund that? Well, it's the same kind of sales pitch that alchemists used to make, right? We're going to give you the secret of matter and eternal life, so please, it's expensive research, right? There are all these patronage suits going on throughout medieval Europe. So it does excite people, right? And therefore it is better for attracting funding. And I think it's the kind of, that's part of the picture of what I think of as the immaturity of science, that we gotta get over, right? This search for the one truth. Because I think, many of the scientists I talk to tell me that the great stumbling block to a reasonable kind of pluralism is in the funding structure, right? And let me something came to my mind that might be relevant. This is something that I read from James Lovelock, the Gaia guy. He wrote at the Millennium in a British newspaper that he thinks that just 1% of the national science budget should go to the crazy people, like himself, right? He didn't say crazy people, but the mavericks, the people with unusual ideas, the out-of-the-box thinkers. Just 1%. So that if it comes to nothing, we won't be that sorry. But some nice things may come of it, right? So I think that kind of thinking is going to be more helpful than, right, I'm going to tell you the truth, so give me billions.
I have a comment
Yes.
regarding that hypothesis that you just presented. I think that the necessity of simplifying a theory into a simpler formulation where you have a smaller number of principles is a wonderful direction that makes science, first of all, simpler and also easier to implement and to think about. If one has a theory for each rock that falls, there is a different gravitational theory. Or you have one theory that simplifies the description of all rocks that fall by a single expression, a single theory, that makes the theory a lot more powerful and makes understanding of the world much more easier. So regardless of funding and regardless of any other goal, the simplification of science into a minimum number of principles is highly desirable. And so when pluralism is useful because there's no way of simplifying it, then in science it is maintained and celebrated. And so it is only reduced when it is found that one of those principles that was thought to be necessary is not necessary. So that's the way science works. You reduce the number of principles to a simpler possible theory.
Sure.
And what Weinberg is saying here is that there is the possibility of making science as simple as it is possibly conceivable, and they're close to achieving that goal.
Yeah.
So that is basically an approach to science that has been pursued for many, many years, and it makes science more powerful and simpler.
Thank you. I certainly agree with that, but I think there is a distinction to be made between simplicity and monopoly, right?
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
In science, there is no suppression.
So your question was long enough, sir. Was that? Your question was long enough. Let's figure and we're already ready.
I mean, think about the GPS case, right? If you try to make the theory of GPS, it would be enormously complicated. So instead, what we do, we have Newtonian mechanics, which is pretty simple. We have quantum mechanics itself, as simple as can be in exactly the way you propose. Likewise for relativity. And then we learn to pull those things together at this point of application, right? So in other words, this desire to keep scientific theories simple may also end up with a pluralistic result, right? Because if the world is a complicated beast and you want simple theories, the best you can have is various theories which simply expresses various aspects of that complex nature, right? Now, if Weinberg's dream would come true, in which we have one simple theory that does everything, yeah, sure, even I might take it. But I would want to make another one.
It seems to me there might be a constraint on pluralism, which is that you have to write as clearly as Lavoisier wrote and tell people as clearly how to do what you're doing so that they can test it out as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one aspect of the whole thing that I didn't go into today is communication, right? Because in my ideal picture of pluralism, it's not just a matter of having different competing traditions that don't talk to each other, right? It's also the higher form of pluralism is the interactive one. And how do we make communication between, let's say, incommensurable paradigms possible? And we have to work pretty hard at that, right? Peter Gallison talks about this. He says, in fact, within modern physics itself, there are three different sub-communities, right? The experimentalist, the theoreticians, and the instrumentation people. And they are really different communities. They don't speak the same language, but they have to come together to do the great experimental work as going on at CERN and other places. So how do they do it? He thinks they have to, in effect, make up on the spot almost pigeon languages, right? These hybrid languages through which they can communicate well enough. And I think we have to think about a lot of these things. And the clarity of communication, as you mentioned, is a key thing. I think it's a great pity that Lavoisier, with that gift of clarity, used it to suppress the opposition rather than trying to communicate with it.
One last question here.
So, unfortunately, I think my question is going to be following up on a lot of these reductionism questions. I think that we've heard a lot of approaches historically of why reductionism might be so attractive to monists. I'm interested why you could say philosophically as opposed to psychologically, reductionism is so powerful. You made this off-the-hand comment, I think you said from your teacher, your former teacher, that reductionism isn't a tide. It just has been at certain moments. Well, have those certain moments just been so conducive in the history of science that are so coincidental that they've overtaken our thinking about monism? Or is there something, I know plenty of philosophers have written about why it's so influential, but as you're a pluralist, why might you think that reductionism is so philosophically attractive?
That's a great question. I used to think that it's that these moments like Maxwellian unification of electricity, magnetism, and light were so impressive and memorable. Likewise, Weinberg's achievements. But now I think there's a deeper layer of the story, which is metaphysical. I can't go into all of that now, but the gist of it is that we seem to have some deep underlying assumptions, a lot of us, that stuff can be smashed up into elementary particles. And everything is made up from elementary particles in the way that we put Lego blocks together to make things. So, philosophers metaphysicians will talk about the mereology of, right, substances and objects. And I think that is actually a very interesting illusion, right? Because modern physics has shown us that elementary particles don't stick together like Lego blocks do, right? I mean, there are extreme cases like pair creation and annihilation, right? So if an electron and positron come together and disappear into gamma rays, are we going to say that the gamma rays are composed of an electron and a positron and vice versa? Well, you can, but not in the sense of Lego blocks, right? In nuclear reactions, energy is always lost and gained or gained. And that means we haven't exactly just put together two neutrons or a proton and a neutron or whatever you've got to make the bigger lump. Because energy is matter and vice versa. You might say, well, it's just a small fractional loss of mass going on in these reactions, but if we did that, then we wouldn't be able to explain nuclear bombs. And that's not a good science if you have to approximate away nuclear explosions. So I think this deep underlying assumption that many philosophers have that physical composition is mereological is at the heart of this drive pulled into reductionism in the metaphysical sense. And once you've granted metaphysical reductionism, it's really an uphill battle to say still we don't give you epistemological reductionism. I mean, people do it, but it's hard work. Right? So I think there is that deeper layer.
Okay, well, let's thank speaker Ben.
Thank you.